CEO was on, actually, its chief investment officer, or its principal investment officer, was on radio about 2 weeks ago, around about when, COSATU first mooted its plan. And he said that, it's not a possibility in the near term at all because of the nuances of how the money is invested and how all of that money supports current market activity in South Africa. So quite frankly, I think one of the reasons why Tito was as bold as he was is because he understands the intricacies of what it would take for the PIC, to shift some of its funds towards Eskom. It's a complicated, it's an intricate process. It requires, a lot of governance protocols to be in place for that to happen, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight, unlike renegotiating a current wage determination with public sector workers, which might take 6 months.
What about the big companies? The big mining companies, the big manufacturing companies. There were no serious tax hikes in this government. In fact, there were some minor tax reductions. Is there any scope, in your view, or the view of some of the social critics around, of hitting the companies up and saying, you did extremely well first under, 50 years of National Party rule in South Africa, and then subsequently you've done pretty well under the ANC. Now's the time for payback. Is there any sense that Ramaphosa's government has the will or inclination to take on some of these companies and say, you're sitting on these massive cash piles, you're not doing anything productive with this money, time to pour it back into the South African economy and help us out here? Is that sort of conversation happening at all? Those demands, are they being made?
Well, I think that conversation took place in the context of the mining charter, and it's an ongoing thing. It's not a one and done. It's not a one-off conversation. I think that those keep, they're ongoing. The thing about it is that you have to understand we've just had, 2 years of Ramaphosa, so and a lot is going on in the country in terms of the government itself and the SOE space, in terms of the broader economy. I mean, we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world and one of the highest rates of inequality in the world. And I think that mining is one sector that could help, but there's a very context specific conversation in that. As I mentioned before, the mining charter. I don't think that Ramaphosa is going to go to anyone and say, give us your money or anything of the sort, because he still needs them to invest in the economy, and there's a clear framework on how those conversations can unfold or take place. The other thing is that these companies have been confronted with an energy crisis, and Tito does say in the budget that electricity is anticipated to hold back growth in the country. It's been a bugbear for South Africa over the past 5-year period as well, with load shedding taking place, as well as the electricity tariffs. So it's a layered conversation. It's a multi-party conversation. It's not just a one-off, as I mentioned before.
On the revenue side of things, it's a lot of people might have hoped with the South Africa Revenue Service coming back under the control of the government, as opposed to officials linked to the former president. There would have been a hope that the tax take would trend back upwards. That's not happened, and obviously there's been very difficult conditions in global commodity markets for South African products, and there's obviously a huge overhang of governance concerns from the Zuma era. But at what point, do we start saying, that the tax take really isn't good enough, and where is the thinking on the people who should start paying?
So I think that there's several ways to answer that question. One of them is to actually look at the overall takings, and one of the biggest revenue lines for the government is personal income tax, strangely enough. And corporate income tax, that category is about, number 3 or 4 on the rankings. And what that says is that, most South Africans are actually overtaxed, and there is no scope to tax them any further. Hence, Tito did not hike personal.
Do you feel overtaxed, Melissa?
I do. I do as an ordinary South African. I mean, good Lord, just on your salary advice, you feel it. Everywhere you go, you feel it. And I think that, it was a welcome announcement to hear that there would be no further hikes in that respect and in that regard. And also, VAT has remained the same; it's unchanged this year. But back to your question about, the revenue takings of SARS, I think that, the new commissioner has been there for less than 6 months. These processes take time. The other thing is that, the corporate sector in this country is retrenching people like there's no tomorrow. I mean, every other week there's an announcement that people are, cutting jobs. One of the examples in the mining sector, for instance, several companies are relooking at their staff numbers. If you go to the telecom sector, if you go to retail, people are reviewing their staffing numbers. They're looking at their overheads, and they're cutting staff. So that's one of the factors that contributes towards lower takings by SARS. But the other thing is that, the operating environment for companies is quite tough in a local context as well as a regional context and the global context as well. So some companies are really struggling under the weight of what's happening in the current environment. In addition to that, our economy is not growing. As I said previously, even National Treasury itself forecasts that the economy will grow 0.9%. That does not support, a growth sort of environment. It does not support tax resilience. It does not support greater spending by consumers in this, context. It does not support greater business confidence. So all of those factors play into what ultimately happens at SARS at the end of the day.
Any other areas you think we should touch on?
Yeah, so, in the midst of all of this, they're planning to start a state bank as well as a sovereign wealth fund. And the state bank, he says, is going to be founded along commercial principles, and it'll be focused on retail banking. And people have said, that seems to be the least of your problems at the moment. Why not just sort out SOEs and demonstrate that you can run them efficiently before starting a state bank? Because the country doesn't have a shortage of retail banks. The other thing is that, does the government have enough resources to start capitalizing and contributing towards the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund? And one of the throwaway lines in there is that, they're looking at the sale of spectrum as a source of funds to capitalize the wealth fund, as well as the sale of state assets. And as I said in a previous story that I did for the Africa report on SAA, is that the government was struggling to dispose of some of its assets to capitalize or to inject some money into SAA. How's it going to do that now for a sovereign wealth fund? It's quite curious.
That's all for this week. If you enjoyed this edition, please let us know by giving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others to find us. Go to theafricareport.com to sign up to our daily wrap, and you can say hi on Twitter at The Africa Report and on our Facebook page. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.